Hi, my name's Dave and I work for Pace, teaming up with local people who follow Jesus to help everyone in schools learn about what it means to be a Christian. We do lessons, assemblies and lunchtime clubs in most of the schools in Bournemouth, Poole and Christchurch, and we have a lot of fun exploring the biggest questions human beings love to ask. This lesson is all about one of those questions. Why would God allow suffering and evil in the world? We'll explore this question and some of the things that Christians believe about God and about suffering and evil. And we'll have some pauses in the video along the way for you to think about and discuss or jot down your thoughts and questions too. By the end of the lesson, you should be able to talk about why some people today might think that God and suffering can't both exist. Explain some of the hidden assumptions behind this argument. Talk about why some people today might say suffering means it's unlikely God exists. Explain some of the other considerations that may mean God's existence is likely. Quote some things the Bible says about God and suffering, about his thoughts, his death, his love and his plans. And finally, you should be able to personally explore the idea that there really is a loving God who wants us to face our best and worst days with him rather than without him. People face all kinds of struggles in this life: poverty, sickness, debt, injustice, natural disasters, crime, addiction, betrayal, murder, war, abuse. The list goes on, and sometimes people will ask, how can there be a good, loving, powerful God when there's all this going on in the world? So here's a question that I want to ask you at the outset of this lesson, and we'll return to it a few times before we're done. Is it possible that there is a God with perfectly good reasons beyond our understanding for allowing the suffering and evil that we see in the world? Yes or no? Pause the video now and take a moment to jot down this question word for word to think about. Don't just go with your gut, but really stop and think carefully about it. Then jot down whether you think the answer is yes or no before we move on. Sometimes when people reflect on the various kinds of suffering and evil in the world, they might think, surely if God exists, all this stuff would not exist. And some people go even further and confidently say that because this kind of suffering does exist, God must not exist at all. Take a look at this video from Reasonable Faith, which looks at this kind of argument and some of the weaknesses it has too.
We are all well aware of the suffering and evil in the world. Horrific suffering, unspeakable evil. How then can anyone believe in the existence of an all-loving, all-powerful God? And if God does exist, why would anyone want to worship him? Epicurus framed the logical problem of suffering and evil like this: if God is willing to prevent evil but not able, then he's not all-powerful. If he is able to prevent evil but not willing, he is not good. But if he is both willing and able, how can evil exist? And if he is neither able nor willing, then why call him God? In other words, it's logically impossible for God and suffering to both exist. But we know full well that suffering exists. Therefore, God does not. Is this a good argument? Let's look at it more closely. Are these two statements logically inconsistent? No. Here is an example of two logical inconsistent statements. David can't be both married and a bachelor. But there is no explicit contradiction between these two statements. So there must be hidden assumptions behind this argument that would bring out the alleged contradiction. Here they are. If God is all-powerful, he can create any world he wants. And if God is all-loving, he prefers a world without suffering. So, if an all-powerful, all-loving God exists, it follows that suffering does not exist. Since suffering obviously does exist, the atheist concludes that God must not exist. But are the atheist's two hidden assumptions necessarily true? Consider the first assumption. Can God create any world He wants? What if He wants a world populated by people who have free will? It's logically impossible for God to force someone to freely choose to do good. Forcing free choices is like making a square circle. It's not logically possible. It's not that God lacks the power to perform the task. It's that the supposed task itself is just nonsense. So, it may not be feasible to create a world populated by people who always freely choose to do what is morally good. So the first assumption is not necessarily true. Therefore, the argument fails. And what about the second assumption? Is it necessarily true that God would prefer a world without suffering? How could we possibly know this? We all know of cases where we permit suffering in order to bring about a greater good. If it's even possible that God allows suffering in order to achieve a greater good, then we cannot say this assumption is necessarily true. For the logical problem of suffering to succeed, the atheist would have to show that it's logically impossible that free will exists, and that it's logically impossible that God has good reasons for permitting suffering. This burden of proof is too heavy to bear. It's quite possible that God and suffering both exist. This is why philosophers, even atheist philosophers, have given up on the logical problem of evil.
We can concede that the problem of evil does not, after all, show that the central doctrines of theism are logically inconsistent with one another. Some philosophers have contended that the existence of evil is logically inconsistent with the existence of a theistic God. No one, I think, has succeeded in establishing such an extravagant claim. It's now acknowledged on almost all sides that the logical argument is bankrupt.
What do you think? Is it really logically impossible for God and suffering to both exist? What are the hidden assumptions in this argument? And why have so many deep-thinking philosophical types given up on it? Have a quick pause now in the video to gather your thoughts and jot them down. So, the logical argument that says that God and suffering can't both exist actually fails because of the big assumptions it makes. Is it possible that there is a God with perfectly good reasons beyond our understanding for allowing the suffering and evil that we see in the world? The answer could still be yes. In the Bible, God says, "As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." But even if it's logically possible that God exists, as well as suffering, is it likely that He does? Have a look at this.
In part 1, we looked at the logical version of the problem of suffering and evil. This argument attempts to show that since suffering and evil exist, it is logically impossible for God to exist. And we explained why even atheist philosophers admit that this argument fails. But wait! It may still be argued that while it's logically possible that God and suffering both exist, it's far from likely. There's just so much pointless suffering, it seems improbable that God could have good reasons for permitting it. This is the probability version of the problem. Suffering provides empirical evidence that God's existence is not impossible, just highly unlikely. Is this a good argument? Consider 3 points. First, we are not in a position to say with any confidence that God probably lacks reasons for allowing the suffering in the world. The problem is that we're limited in space and time, and in intelligence and insight. God, on the other hand, sees every detail of history from beginning to end, and orders it through people's free decisions and actions. In order to achieve His purposes, God may have to allow a great deal of suffering along the way. Suffering which appears pointless within our limited scope of understanding may be seen to have been justly permitted by God within His wider framework. Sometimes, what we experience makes no sense until we gain a wider perspective and see the big picture designed by the Creator. Here's the second point. Relative to the full scope of the evidence, God's existence may well be probable. You see, probabilities are always relative to background information. For example, if we consider only how much this man weighs, we would say it's highly improbable that he's a world-class athlete. But when we're willing to consider new information, that he's a professional sumo wrestler and a world champion, we quickly revise our view. In the same way, when the atheist claims that God's existence is improbable, we should ask, improbable relative to what background information? If we consider only the suffering in the world, then God's existence may very well appear to be improbable. But if we're willing to look at the full scope of background information, to take into account the powerful arguments for God's existence, we may come to a very different conclusion. The third point is, Christianity entails doctrines that increase the probability of the coexistence of God and suffering. Consider four of these. First, the chief purpose of life is not happiness. People often assume that if God exists, His role is to create a comfortable environment for His human pets. They think the ultimate goal of our lives on earth is happiness, and therefore, God is obligated to keep us happy. However, Christianity presents a radically different view, that the purpose of life is to know God. This alone brings true, lasting fulfillment. Suffering can bring about a deeper, more intimate knowledge of God, either on the part of the one who is suffering or those around him. The whole point of human history is that God, having given us free will, is drawing as many people as He can into His unending kingdom. Suffering is one of the ways God can draw people freely to Himself. In fact, countries that have endured the most hardship often show the highest growth rates for Christianity.
God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our consciences, but shouts in our pains. It is His megaphone to rouse a deaf world.
Second, mankind is in a state of rebellion against God and His purpose. Terrible human evils are testimony to man's depravity, a consequence of his alienation from God. The Christian isn't surprised at moral evil in the world. On the contrary, he expects it. The third doctrine states that God's purpose is not restricted to this life, but spills over beyond the grave into eternal life. This world is just the beginning, the entryway to an unimaginable, never-ending life beyond death's door. Paul, who wrote much of the New Testament, underwent afflictions, hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, hunger. Yet he wrote, "We do not lose heart, for this slight momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. Because we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal." Paul understood that life on earth and whatever suffering it holds for each of us is temporary. Our pain will not endure forever, but our lives with God will. Paul was not belittling the plight of those who suffer horribly in this life. Indeed, he was one of them. But he saw that those sufferings will be overwhelmed forever by the ocean of joy that God will give to those who will freely receive it. And the fourth doctrine is this: the knowledge of God is an incomparable good. Knowing God is the ultimate fulfillment of human existence, an infinite good. Thus, the person who knows God, no matter how much he has suffered, can still say, "God is good to me." So, if Christianity is true, it's not at all improbable that suffering and evil should exist. In summary, for all these reasons, the probability version of the problem of evil is no more successful than the logical version. As a purely intellectual problem, then, the problem of evil does not disprove God's existence.
What do you think? Does the existence of suffering and evil really mean there's probably no God? How could anyone be sure about this? And what other things are there, other than suffering, to consider that might make us think just the opposite? Pause again now to discuss or collect your thoughts and jot them down. So if suffering and evil don't make it impossible that God exists, and don't necessarily mean it's improbable either, how does this help us with our question? Is it possible there is a God with perfectly good reasons beyond our understanding for allowing the suffering and evil that we see in the world? The answer could still be yes. And the video we've just seen argues that it's not just possible, but probable too. And personally, I'd go even further. If we say no to our question, then I think we've misunderstood the word God. If God really is God, and I'm not, then I think it's safe for me to assume that he knows better than me, and is better than me, in every possible way. And that means he must have good reasons beyond my understanding for allowing the suffering and evil we see in the world. It's not just possible or probable, but it's inevitable that he would. He's God. But does all this philosophical deep thinking help me when I'm struggling on my worst day? Actually, it does a bit. It helps me think straight and literally not lose the plot when life gets hard. But we do need so much more than logical arguments when this life does its worst to us, don't we? I don't just need God's existence. I need his love.
As a purely intellectual problem, then, the problem of evil does not disprove God's existence. But even if those intellectual arguments fail, the emotional problem of suffering and evil remains very powerful. If you have suffered deeply, or if you've watched someone you love go through intense pain, you may be thinking, so what if God exists? Why would I want to respond to him or worship him? I feel cold and empty and want nothing to do with him. You're not alone. God knows your name. He knows who you are and what you're going through. God promises to be with you through your suffering. He can give you the strength to endure. Jesus Christ also suffered. Although he was innocent, he was tortured and sentenced to death. His suffering had a purpose: to provide you and me with a life-giving connection to God. Not only does God exist, but he loves you. He seeks after you. He offers you hope. And in time, he will make all things new.
He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away.
As a Christian, I don't just believe in my head that God exists. I experience a relationship with God through Jesus and face my best and my worst days with him. And I trust his big plan to make all things new one day in a world free from suffering and evil. Corrie ten Boom, a Christian lady who survived a Nazi concentration camp during the Second World War and saw some of the worst kinds of suffering, said this: "When a train goes through a tunnel and it gets dark, you don't throw away the ticket and jump off. You sit still and trust the engineer." What do you think of this kind of approach to the problem of evil and suffering in the world? Why would a Christian continue to trust God even in the midst of the worst things that can happen? Have a pause now to think about this one. The Bible shows us a God who suffered for us so we could know him. It says Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. It describes a God who suffers with us and wants to help us get through it. God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in times of trouble. And the Bible also invites us to trust God's purposes that are beyond what we can imagine right now. Paul, who suffered more than most for being a follower of Jesus, said this: "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us." Trusting and following Jesus makes me grateful for the journey so far, strong for the challenges of today, and hopeful for everything that's to come. I hope this lesson has been helpful to you on your journey. We'll finish with one couple's story of God's faithfulness through suffering.
And I'm a critical care nurse by background. And I have like the world-renowned experts at Sick Kids telling me that her diagnosis is terrible, like it's bad. And, they're preparing you for what potentially is going to happen. And people are always saying, she's going to be fine. She's going to be fine. And I thought, I want her to be fine. With everything in me, I want her to be fine. But the reality is that, like, I understand the statistics, right? There's 50%. She was given 50%. And there was a girl the exact same age with the same diagnosis in the room across from us. So that meant that either Mackenzie was going to die or that girl was going to die. And that's what it meant to me. So I used to ask God, what do I say when people say, she's going to be okay? And God said to me, I am faithful regardless of the outcome. That's not really what I wanted to hear. I wanted to hear, your daughter's going to be saved. But that's not what I heard. So I thought, that's true. He's faithful regardless of the outcome. And he is. And, I was holding her in that bed and watching her drift away and watching her breathing getting slower and slower. When she took that last breath and the blood drained from her lips, and I saw it, because I'm a nurse, so I look for these things, and I saw the color leave her lips, and I knew she was gone, and I just felt with absolute assurance that she was with Jesus. And, there's no one, the only person who loved her more than Dave and I is God, so it's a good place for her to be.
We don't have all the answers, but we trust in him. And he's been faithful to walk alongside of us this long. Why would he stop now?
Yeah.
There is so much more out there. There are so many others out there who need to know his love, who doubt that they are worthy, perhaps, of a divine love so great, so vast, and so unimaginable. But we've discovered that he loves so beautifully and so honestly. And we just hope that others can realize how beautiful is the love of God, how wide and deep, how long and high is his love for us and for them.